communication. We're in Conrad, welcome to Ticker Newsroom.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And has evolved into a fintech.
Guys, thanks for joining us on this very special video that Maqro will be hosting. We will be focusing today on our corporate finance division. That's where we give clients access to research and transactions in IPOs, pre-IPOs, placements, early stage companies. And today, we're actually very proud to have with us Dr. Len Walker. So Dr. Len Walker is the Managing Director of Chaucer Energy. Now, just to give you guys a little bit of a backstory, we managed to get on to AusBiz last week, actually, and we were featured on their special, their IPO special. It was the first one with David Koshi and Chris McDonald from Morgans. And we went through 10 companies that were either listed or looking to list. And then we also had an additional stock of the day, which was the ASX. Now, during that interview, which we only have about 3 days to prepare for, but during this interview, Chaucer Energy was a company which is looking to list and that we covered. Now, one of the big focuses at Maqro is our objectivity. It's our pursuit for truth. And also we wanted to share with you what the steps are when it comes to our due diligence process in finding these opportunities for our clients. So firstly, what we like to do is have a fairly broad spectrum of companies that we would look at. That then gets filtered down through some very strict criteria. Fundamentally is sort of the key focus for us. And then from there, we do sort of our initial research. The initial research is a component where we pride ourselves in, but at the same time, we are human. Sometimes we get it wrong. Today, we've got, like I said, we've got the Managing Director of Chaucer Energy himself, looking to clarify and really challenge some of the positions that we had in that interview. That's today. We've managed to organize a very special interview with you guys where we're going to go through everything, all the key points that we had, any concerns about. Also, we're going to be giving Len the opportunity to really walk us through what their plans are for this company and the listing coming up very shortly. So without further ado, I'll get the AusBiz interview coming up now so you can have a look at what actually transpired.
Sam wants a view on Chaucer Energy. This is a gas producer, but produces the gas out of coal fields using technology pioneered in the Soviet Union back in the 30s. This is an amazing story going through this. Now, in Australia, you can only do it in Queensland because there's bans in Australia from getting gas out of coal fields. But in Chile and South American countries, in southern Chile, they've really got a big market apparently. Issue price at 20 cents, raising about 5.5 million. Chris?
All right, so we just talked about we're really giving someone some money to drill and hopefully we find something and everyone gets rich, right?
Yeah.
Which can be fun, but it's a different risk profile. This is different in the sense that we're going into Chile. Since Pinochet, it's been reasonably okay, although there's been some little bit of tension. So a bit more sovereign risk. Len Walker, who is behind a listed company in Australia called Lead Creek, in South Australia, has proven this technology works in Australia with coal beds. Again, he's been frustrated by the current laws, so he's gone, well, where is there a need to use this technology that's been around for 90 years? And he's shown it works in Australia. So he's now going, well, Chile imports 100% of their energy. They have a need, they're happy to play, they're going to approve, and they may have a plant in 2023. So we've got a different risk reward profile here. Because there's risk, you can buy it fairly cheaply. Yeah. You're probably going to have to back the management here that have shown that they can do it with technology that's been around for a while. And you're going to have to be patient. I mean, this is a risk you've got to go through. They've got to drill, they've got to prove it, they've got to do a lot of environmental, that it doesn't leak into the water table and things like that. So risk is high, but the reward, if you can have an alternative locally produced power, which is a greenhouse gas but not as bad as coal, and you've got demand from a government, the rewards are very high.
Yeah.
So yes, it's a big risk reward play. I'd probably again be prepared to wait. But I like the theme, I like the problem it's solving. So there's definitely interest there, but we're still in that high risk, be prepared to lose it all because you know, it hasn't been tried in Chile before.
Yep. High risk. Conrad?
We spoke about what I look for in a company, what we do. We understand the story. We dive deep into the actual details. And as a result, our opinion is extremely widely different. So I'll start from the beginning. Phoenix Energy in 2016 is what they started as, reborn as Chaucer in 2019. Now the actual tech ISG, so in situ gasification. So they take sort of really deep coal that's usually unavailable for open cut methods, and they take that and they pressurize it and use oxidants to heat it up, and that turns into what's called syngas. Syngas then turns into electricity. Now, so what they're trying to do is go to Chile and use this technology and sell the electricity. They tried this twice before. Third time lucky, I don't think so. So first time in Queensland. Now, they might have had some success, but in terms of the government basically said, so there's 3 companies doing this. And they said, okay, we're going to ban you and shut you down because we've noticed unusually high benzene traces in neighboring bores. So they get kicked out. So then they went to Indonesia. Indonesia said, okay, the permits they're not commercial, so they got declined there. So now they've gone to Chile. Now I understand why they're going to Chile, the whole coal play, I get it. However, one of the things that management has overlooked here is that there is a broader rhetoric in Chile to actually move away from coal as an energy source. Now they've got an agreement in place with the Chilean government and electricity generation companies that's looking to phase out coal as an energy source in 20 years. So this is very much a process where they have to apply for a lot of these regulatory applications and through these bodies. That's been a major struggle for them. In Chile, so the Chilean government has actually come out and said they don't have any experience in ISG projects. So that's uncertain. Now that doesn't mean they're not going to take it on or whatever, but that's
so a bit too high risk.
Yeah, it's too much.
All right.
So thanks for joining us, Len, and I appreciate you making the time to be a part of this conversation. We've spoken now very briefly, about the interview, which the audience has now seen. Also, we've spoken about what your future prospects are and what you guys are planning on. I'd love to share that with the rest of our client base. Firstly, I was just hoping to sort of get a brief introduction of yourself and sort of the management team.
I appreciate making the contact with you, Conrad, and I look forward to going through some of the details of the interview and what our position is. The whole ISG story is a very long one. Very briefly, myself and my management team have a very long experience in this in a variety of different ways. I've been responsible for 2 demonstrations in Queensland, which I'm sure we'll talk about later on. As have my colleagues, and my technology partner, Michael Blinderman, has wide range experience himself. Perhaps if I can briefly summarise some of the history of ISG and where my team fits in, it might help give the perspective of our background. I first got involved in this, funnily enough, looking at the prospectivity of the Lee Creek area, which of course has been taken up by Lee Creek Energy. And so I know something of what they're doing, and that was in the early 1980s. So that's a long time ago. I really got involved more aggressively in the 1990s when I learned a bit more about the history, and you can't really understand ISG, I think, without fully appreciating what the history is. It really originated in the former Soviet Union back in the 1920s and 30s under Stalin. It had a very long history of research and then commercialisation. And in the 1960s, finished up, there were 2 or 3 commercial-sized projects. When I say commercial, the main one, which is at a town called Angren in Uzbekistan, was producing enough gas, if we were using modern turbines, would have generated maybe 60 to 80 megawatts of power. That's what I call a commercial sized project. And outside the former Soviet Union, That hasn't been replicated anywhere, and that's really what our plan is. I visited the former Soviet Union in Uzbekistan 3 times in the 1990s and formed an association with them. We got on very well, and that's the kind of a background that I'm working on, their technology and their methodology as part of what I've adopted in the companies I've been involved in. As you may know, I founded Link Energy in 1996. We did a very significant pilot demonstration that gasified 35,000 tonnes of coal from 1999 to 2002. We were in partnership with a government organisation at that stage, and when we ran out of money, effectively as a private company, they withdrew their funding. It left us in a difficult position, and
right.
The company was then taken over by another group. They haven't been particularly successful in trying to develop the Chinchilla project, but it's important to understand that the 2.5 years we ran this demonstration project, which was the biggest outside the former Soviet Union, we had no environmental problems at all. We were informing the Environment Department in Queensland every month, and it was shut down, and there were no environmental problems at all.
Okay.
Because of the lack of funding, then I set up Cougar Energy, which started another similar project in Queensland.
Mm-hmm.
That had a long history, which we'll probably come to
Yep.
in discussing government attitudes, but
Yep.
sufficient to say the whole industry got shut down in Queensland some 7 or 8 years ago for reasons which I considered to be political, because I was in the middle of it all at the time.
Yeah.
So that has had if you like, a very negative impact on developing the technology in Australia. But apart from the history in the former Soviet Union, there have been demonstration projects done in a whole range of different countries. There was a major program in the US. There's about $500 million of research funding in the 1980s and 90s.
South Africa as well, I believe.
South Africa is sitting there at the moment, yes, and they're looking for funding to commercialise a project. Pilot demonstration was done in New Zealand.
Yep.
And there's very strong interest in India and Indonesia. So despite the fact that there's not a lot going on actually in the field in terms of production of gas, there is a very wide interest worldwide still on seeing this developed. And of course, if it's commercialised, or when it's commercialised and when we are successful, I've got no doubt that the technology will be taken up in a range of different countries and might actually be returned to Australia, which has a substantial need for gas, as we all know.
Yeah, yeah. And the actual technology of ISG, so one of the big challenges that I had was I needed to become a scientist overnight, really, for this interview that I conducted with AusBiz. But I did find out that in a sort of general form, it's for coal that's way too deep for general sort of traditional open cut methods. And then there's this process where you effectively heat it up, quite a lot of pressure using oxidants, which then transitions that into what's called syngas. Can you walk us through exactly from an expert, what does that process look like for the everyday person? I mean, what really is the benefits of this technology?
Well, first and foremost, we need to be deep for a number of reasons. The predominant one is it's a bit like, if you think of it as an underground coal mine, a substitute for mining coal underground, which is why it was introduced in the former Soviet Union, then you'll appreciate that if you remove all the coal, whether it's by mining or by converting into gas, then if you're not careful, you'll have roof collapse and you'll have escape of gas to the surface, and you can have more or less an environmental problem of significance. There's a long history of what you have to do to avoid that. And so being at depth, say 200 metres below the ground surface, is one of the requirements for that reason. But also that coal is hardly ever utilised by anybody else. So it's a valuable introduction of a new resource. As far as the process goes, it's very simple to explain, I think, but not necessarily easy to undertake. In terms of the explanation, you very simply take 2 drill holes, maybe 20, to 50 metres apart. You drill them into the coal seam. First thing you do is pump air under pressure into one of them and get connection through to the second. That's kind of air testing, if you like.
Yep.
Once you know that the pathways are clear, then you inject oxygen. Well, you're injecting air anyway, so you ignite the air because the oxygen's in the air. You ignite that at the bottom of the first well. You get combustion, complete combustion. You get carbon dioxide and steam. The temperature's about 1,000 degrees, and under the pressure of injection, the hot carbon dioxide and steam run through the coal seam towards the production well. On the way through, there's very little oxygen, so you don't get combustion, but you get a series of chemical reactions. And the chemical reactions produce a gas called syngas, which is actually a mixture of methane, hydrogen, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, and steam, which come out at the other end. And that's the gas that's produced. It can be burnt simply for power generation, which is our first phase. But because the gases are actually separated, you can actually use the individual components of gas for other purposes, such as making chemicals, as Lee Creek Energy is doing. But as I say, it's explained very simply, but the control of it all underground needs a very considerable experience to make sure it's done properly.
Okay. So I guess one of the big points of concern that my research team had, which was then sort of communicated to the audience of AusBiz in that interview, was obviously the environmental risks that might come from this type of technology or operation, and how that sort of affects the ability of Chaucer Energy to execute their regulatory requirements. And we'll go into sort of the specifics of that, I think, in some later questions. But we felt you had some issues in Queensland. Now, my understanding from our brief discussion is that wasn't actually the reason why the shutdown happened. Can you clarify firstly what are those risks? Why is this something that is actually not the easiest thing to just get through a regulatory body? I mean, I think that's with a lot of energy projects, to be fair. But this one specifically, what are the main ones that you as a company have to be aware of? And also tell us a little bit about Queensland, so that we've got the right information as well.
Yes. I'll try and be concise, Conrad, because after spending more or less 10 years in trying to commercialise this in Queensland, there's
lots that happen.
A very long history. Yes. Yeah. I guess the essence of, well, firstly, what is the main environmental problem? And I think there's no doubt whether it's a factual statement based on technical aspects, as I might say it, or whether it's publicity. I don't want to use the word scaremongering, perhaps, but there I've said it, which is used in the public environment, in the public area. It's to do with groundwater contamination. Now, this process produces some chemicals that are particularly benzene, considered to be carcinogenic. But there are standards that are set in relation to levels of benzene and where it's appropriate, whether it's in drinking water. I can say that of the two projects I've been involved in Queensland, and the third one, which was run by another company called Carbon Energy, despite all of the kind of discussion about environmental concerns, none of those three projects created environmental problems in groundwater. I might say that internationally, over the last 20 or 30 years, there have probably been 60 or 70 demonstrations of this technology, and only 2 of them have ever raised issues of groundwater contamination. The first one was one in 1975 in the US, when they were learning the technology, where there's some very bad choices of location made, which are set out in the literature and commented on reasonably. And the second is the one recently publicised by Link Energy, who took over the management, who took over my company and the site at the time, And the factual information in relation to that's a bit vague because there's not much information, actually technical information documented. So, but obviously they were not capable of undertaking the technology properly. So in the grand scheme of things, there's only 2 out of 70 demonstrations that have been shown to maybe have some problems. And that means nobody's killed. There's no major contamination, drinking water, there's no loss of life, etc. But it raises a significant issue.
Of course.
So we accept that.
Yeah.
And the handling of it is very simple, really. Firstly, you control the pressure in the cavity. I'll get a little technical here, but we are at 200 metres, we are actually effectively underwater. There's a thing called a water table where people draw and extract water near the surface. And when you're at 200 metres, there's a very high pressure of water in the coal. So as long as the injection pressure of the air is less than the pressure in the water, it means there's a cavity, water flows into the cavity, not away from the cavity. And everyone knows that that's the way you handle the issue. So not only do you control the pressure that you inject in relation to the water pressure, but in addition, as a backup, you have a series of monitoring wells around the site, which is what we did at in our both Chinchilla and our Kingaroy projects, so that you get warning if there is anything going wrong and you can do something about it. It's not dissimilar from any other management of potential risks in mining projects.
Okay, and what happened in Queensland? There was some media publication that we were basing our sort of research on, just in regards to the shutdown that happened. But after discussing with you post the Ausbiz interview, I felt as though, you know, you guys were effectively unfairly, you know, sort of charged with that. Was that then disputed? What was the outcome of that? How did that actually all go down?
Yes, well, I can understand people reading the popular press of what their views might be.
Yeah.
There's many stories I could tell about the politics of what was going on in Queensland at the time, essentially because we were offering to produce cheap gas for domestic use. And I should emphasise that our gas is really for domestic use, not for travelling over long distances or converting into LNG and exporting. We were offering the prospect of very cheap domestic gas supply in competition with what was then growing as a coal seam gas industry.
Yeah.
I sat on committees with representatives from Origin and Santos to discuss working together. I don't think they had much interest in working together. Sure. And that really was part of the overlay of what was going on at the time.
Wow.
What actually happened at Kingaroy, which was the essence of the comment that was made in your interview, was essentially that what you might have read in the paper, that we produced benzene and basically a contaminant, and that's why we were shut down. The facts actually were fairly, and they're well documented, were fairly clear. Namely, that we got a high level of benzene reading. If I can tell you what's high, it's 84 parts per billion. That was considered high from a monitoring bore that had no previous benzene measured at all. Under instruction from the government to tell them straight away if we had a problem, we told them the next day. They called a meeting the day after. In the meantime, we had a check test done in the laboratory, and the check test showed no benzene.
Oh, right.
We warned the government that this was the case at the meeting. I think they were going to shut us down at that meeting, but basically we agreed that if they took their own sample and did their own test and it was acceptable, then nothing would happen. The understanding. In fact, they did take their own sample and did their own test, and there was no benzene either. And in the meantime, the laboratory, after questioning, the laboratory told us they basically mixed up samples. So in fact, they tested the wrong sample. The sample
expensive mix-up.
Yes, the sample I had tested was actually right alongside where the process was operating. So obviously it had benzene in it.
Right.
One was 200 metres away and would have been considered to be a difficulty. So essentially, the day after we gave all this information to the government, and I think late in the afternoon, of the following day, they advised us they were shutting us down because of our benzene problem. We believe obviously was not a problem.
Yeah.
All that is documented. We finished up suing the government for $30 million because of misleading information. And of course, we couldn't afford to continue the legal case. And eventually we just shut down. We were ordered to shut down and leave the state.
Wow.
So it's a long story, and I can understand just reading press releases can be a bit disturbing. All of the information actually was on the website because we were publicly listed, so we had to document it all. But I think it's a bit hard to find that information, given it was 7 or 8 years ago.
Yeah, I think it's been actually a very interesting experience, not only for myself but for the research team here, to be able to challenge the information on major media outlets, which you'd think they'd get it right, or at least update the information. But I think when you go a little bit deeper, it's always the case that there's other interests at play. Things are very complicated, and speaking to yourself very directly about these issues, I think has been a really sort of good exercise for us, not only for this transaction, but for other IPOs in the future for us to do research on. So I appreciate your response, Dr. Lynn Walker. So I guess the next question that we had, I guess a little bit sort of in line with this environmental sort of thematic. So you've got the Chilean government, and again, one of the major statements that I think you didn't like was that we felt as though the management team of Chaucer Energy had overlooked the sort of moving away of from coal as an energy source. Now, tell me more about that. Tell me how ISG is a little bit different. What communication you guys have already received potentially, and just any more context that you can provide on that on the Chilean government's sort of perspective.
Well, we're all aware that many countries are talking about carbon neutral by 2050. And at the time we first went over there, we were aware of that. So carbon neutrality in 2050 can mean different things to different people, but we were aware of that. So as part of our discussions with the government, we actually got and I might say we had, I don't know, maybe a dozen meetings with different government departments at different times over the 2 years or so we've been going over there. And they made the statement, particularly the mining department made the statement very clear that the government has a policy of carbon neutrality at 2050. That's not no coal, it's carbon neutrality. But by 2040, that is in 20 years' time, they have a policy of closing all coal-fired power stations. Now, because of that,
to assist with that neutrality.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's a program of no coal-fired power stations by 2040 and carbon neutrality by 2050. So obviously it was important for me to discuss in some detail what that meant.
Yeah.
Because of the shutdown of coal-fired power plants, I said, why are you just talking about coal-fired power plants? Their response was very clear. It wasn't so much the use of coal, it was the fact the locals around these plants were regularly complaining about emissions, not just CO2, obviously, because you can't see it and smell it, but other emissions like particulates and sulfur dioxide and nitrous oxides, and ash disposal and tailings dams, and all of those things were complaints they were regularly getting. And so that, if you like, was the focus, which coal, the fact that it's coal is secondary in a sense. But of course, shutting down coal-fired power plants means you're not using coal for manufacturing energy. So my next question really was, where does that put us? So because the question wasn't so much about using coal, it was about the surface impacts. The discussion, which was very open, was that we're producing gas. We're producing gas and generating electricity from it. And that's different. They were quite comfortable with the fact that by 2040, ours is not a coal-fired power plant, it's a gas-producing plant, and therefore it was perfectly acceptable.
Okay, fantastic.
In relation to 2050, we're going to be in the same position as anybody else producing energy.
Sure.
There are ways of which we can produce gas using ISG, and make it carbon neutral, such as sequestration of CO2 at depth, which Lee Creek Energy is talking about as well. And as you know, reforestation is a significant part of most countries for carbon dioxide sequestration. So we have a number of options up our sleeve over the next 30 years, which will obviously develop as we get further down the track.
So really to summarize that, there's really two components of this environmental movement in Chile. One is 2040, which really doesn't include you guys because of the technology and being gas. And then 2050, well, that's everyone has to deal with. Fantastic. I appreciate that clarity. It does provide us with a lot more, I think, confidence in the actual location of where you guys have decided to go. Okay, and then so the next question that we have to try to find out more about the potential of Chaucer Energy is really now, where's the coal? The Moreland project, I believe, is the flagship project. That's the one where we've got sort of most confidence in. Now, the JORC confirmation is, I think, obviously what all investors will be looking at, to sort of make sure that you guys have struck in the right place. Can you tell us a little bit about that, more about the actual project of Moreland and how confident you guys are at this stage, given it's still early times?
We chose that for two reasons, that location for two reasons, really. One was the data that was available on assessing the coal deposit. And secondly was the fact that we have electricity grid on the site at the moment, so that we don't have to use diesel and costly means. So we have a line capacity of 3 or 4 megawatts onto the site, which we can utilise for importing energy to get started, and we can use it for export of 3 or 4 megawatts when we get underway. And in addition, the main grid system, there's a very large substation only 20 kilometres away, connected into the main national grid system in Chile, which is extremely good because it runs the whole length of the country from north to south. So we're virtually within a stone's throw of the main grid system. My experience of ISG projects in the past is, as well as looking at the coal deposit and its suitability and picking an end product, you have to have a concept of how the project's going to be developed early on, because if it's too difficult, then the costs might count against you. So those are the two reasons. Now, as far as the coal deposit is concerned, there's a collection of information that gives us great confidence that the deposit will be suitable for a JORC resource. We have 2 drill holes, old oil and gas wells. One is just off the north edge of our permit area, and the other's off the south edge. The one off the north edge has a number of coal seams actually recorded, but there's one of 7 metres thick at 200 metres, which is exactly the depth we're after. And on the other coal, the other oil and gas well at the south, there's 3 metres of coal. In addition, in between them, we have a couple of geophysical methods, gravimetric and magnetic surveys that link the 2 oil and gas wells together. And further, we have a significant distance to the north. We have coal exposures of 5 or 6 metres in the ocean, on the ocean shoreline. So connecting all of those pieces of information together gives us great comfort that we'll establish a JORC resource fairly quickly.
Okay, right.
The target we're after is if we're going to produce 100 or 200 megawatts, which might be a long-term aim of electricity, something like 50 million tonnes is what we're aiming for. We only need 5 metres of coal over about a quarter of our permit area to provide that tonnage. So it's not as if we need coal everywhere.
So it's, naturally, as in the exploration game, there's a risk component to it, but it seems to me that given the location and how you guys have investigated everything, there is some type of confidence that this JORC confirmation will come through. Now, if it does, and obviously important word here is if, but if it does come through, what does that mean for shareholders in terms of, let's say, an increased valuation of the business? Naturally, our clients, if they are looking at this interview, any investor, what they should be thinking about and what they will be thinking about is how am I going to make money? And so it sounds to me a key milestone for the company is this JORC confirmation naturally. What are the numbers we're looking at if you guys do strike?
Well, there's two significant aspects of the JORC resource. One is the revaluation, which I'll come to. But the second, which of course for somebody like me who's been involved in this technology for so long and had experience I've seen operating plants in Uzbekistan, and I've been involved in demonstrations, is that once we actually know there's a JORC resource, we are, I can say, 95% certain that we'll produce gas. It's been done so many times before. Mm-hmm. The two companies I manage both produce gas, and my colleagues who worked in the former Soviet Union have done that 3 or 4 times in other countries, South Africa, New Zealand,
right.
Uzbekistan, Queensland. So the confidence of producing gas is extremely high. And once we're producing gas, we have the gas engines tagged, GE gas engines, GE gas turbines, all are specifically proven and commercially available for producing electricity. So the JORC resource really triggers off the project as a continuous exercise. So I put that second because, developing the project ultimately is what we're all about in the medium term. Mm-hmm. But of course, in terms of valuations, we can only make analogies, I suppose. And back in 7 or 8 years ago, when there were 3 companies active in ISG in Queensland, the capitalisations varied from the maximum capitalisations varied from, I think ours, Cougar Energy, was 130 or 140 million after the JORC resource. Carbon Energy was actually 300 million, and of course Link Energy, with some rather excessive promotion perhaps, got up to 1.5 billion.
Yeah, right.
I'm not claiming that for a minute, but I think Lee Creek Energy's position as the only other company active in Australia in this field, courtesy of support from the South Australian government, its market capitalisation, as you know, has been as high as 200 million, and currently it's over 100 million. So it goes without saying, with an EV of 10 million, which is our listing EV, and initial market cap of 15 million, if you add the 5 million, there's a huge scope for capital
gains, growth,
development. Yes.
Okay, fantastic. And I think the sort of next follow-up question to that is, so one of the components of I guess risk that my team was discussing with me prior to my interview on AusBiz. And again, we've got 2 minutes to speak about the company, so it's hard to go through everything in the detail that we're doing now. But one of the things that we were concerned about was the need, the capital intensiveness, and need to raise capital. I mean, it's a good thing for a company like Chaucer Energy to have to raise capital because it means you're progressing. That being said, how much you're raising, let's say, and the capabilities of you to do that is really the focus here. How capital intensive is it really to sort of execute this project? And what are the hurdles that you think you as the managing director will face, but also how are you planning to sort of take on those major hurdles surrounding capital raisings or capital intensive projects?
Well, we've got a 4 or 5 year strategy, Conrad, that comes largely from my experiences over the last 20 or 30 years. Not all successful, but it certainly full of
sometimes the best type of experience, eh?
Yes. So in the prospectus, you'll see that our use of funds, let's start with our use of funds, raising 4.5 to 5.5 million. Mm-hmm. That covers the first 2 years, but in fact, we won't have spent a large amount of money drilling. That we've got a 10-hole program, about 3,000 metres, which is not huge and not hugely expensive. So maybe there's only 400,000 or so to spend on the drilling program, and that will establish our JORC resource. And our plan is to have that done by the middle of next year, so that in 6 months after listing, we'll have a JORC resource and be ready to start the project seriously.
Yeah.
The next phase of that really is about 12 months of what we call site characterization. That basically is drilling and testing the ground and the coal to establish the design parameters for the process. That's a well-established procedure. And in addition, setting up these monitoring bores that I've mentioned that will be ultimately the protection against any leakage if ever that occurred. After we've done all that test work, we're installing our first 3 production wells. That's included in the capital we're raising, and should be completed in our plan by the middle of 2021, 18 months after listing.
Yeah.
So 18 months after listing, we'll have spent not all of the money. We'll probably have at least $500,000 or a bit more available at the time. We'll be in a position to ignite and start producing gas. Now, my experience in the past has been very much, there's no point in igniting and not having a use for the gas, because all that'll happen is you'll spend a lot of money burning gas, flaring it, and not having any productivity. So our plan is to install the production wells, get everything ready for ignition, and then raise the capital for the first phase of our electricity generation, which we're defining as 3 megawatts. The cost of the capital required to produce additional capital to produce 3 megawatts is a bit uncertain. If we have to buy the gas engines we'd use, they're about $1 million a megawatt, so that's $3 million for a start. We'll have an asset. We may be able to lease them. My best guess at the moment is that there might be a range of, say, $6 to $10 million that we'll need to raise in it, which we would raise in equity at the time. Of course, that will just start generating $2 million a year roughly in revenue. So we basically have a revenue base to offset our costs, ongoing costs. But then we will have started the electricity generation process. The reason for using equity there is that my belief that debt funding is not practical at that stage until you've actually produced electricity at a certain level, so you can give people comfort that the process actually works.
Yeah.
Once we've raised that equity and we're producing 3 megawatts, then we have a stage program of working up, hopefully towards, we're planning to work towards 100 megawatts over the 3, in a series of stages that may use gas engines for small amounts of electricity up to maybe 30 or 40 megawatts, and then you can switch to gas turbines. And those expansions will be a mixture of debt and equity and project financing in the conventional way. So all of that is kind of laid out in our plans over the next 4 or 5 years.
Fantastic. Awesome. Well, thanks for that response. Now, I guess just to take a step back again into that environmental component, it'll be the last time, I promise you, Len.
No, that's all right. Everybody else focuses on it, Conrad, so we're used to it.
I think this is the key here. You know, we look at this business as having sort of an exciting future if these sort of major risks are overcome. One of those risks that we're looking at is obviously the regulatory approval, not only from the Chilean government, but also the EEA, the Environmental Evaluation Agency, and getting that impact assessment. Now, given your experience in not only Chile, but other governments dealing with this, so I just a little bit of a side point. The old man of mine actually was heavily involved in a lot of private equity globally, starting from even sort of agricultural land over in Laos to energy projects, throughout sort of Asia as well. It's not a Asia-specific problem, this regulatory approval situation. And I think especially in energy, in coal, this is where the big concerns are. That being said, we'd love to hear what your experience has been with this kind of stuff, and in the situation that you're in now, how far has that actually progressed? From our understanding of the material that we have, it's difficult to sort of gauge where you're up to in the process. Shine some light in how confident you guys are to get to not have any sort of hiccups along the way. In this regard.
Well, I've got a lot of experience in regulatory agencies in a number of countries where I've endeavoured to look at developing projects.
Yeah.
We know the Queensland story well. It's a comfort, at least, that South Australian government is supportive of the technology within Australia, so there's some hope for the future.
That's right.
I spent a lot of time in India, Pakistan, and more recently Indonesia. The regulations there, it's not just what you might say environmental regulations, it's permitting regulations.
Correct.
And support for the technology.
Mm-hmm.
For example, and we mentioned this in the prospectus, Indonesia has got a huge potential for this technology, which they need, but there's regulations in relation not to the environment, but regulations into non-government organisations being able to introduce new technologies, which was a major obstacle. So I must say, arriving in Chile might have been a bit of I won't say an accident, because I knew about the history of the previous interest in ISG. But since I've been there and going through all the systems and talking to all the government departments, it's the greatest comfort that I can want, that I don't think I've run into such a supportive environment.
Right.
As you may know, they import practically all of their energy, 100% of their coal, 80% of their oil and gas. They've had to build LNG terminals, and they're only 60% of their domestic energy supply is burning wood, for heaven's sake.
Wow.
So as far as environment's concerned, I attended a meeting with the environmental manager in the mining department, and he mentioned this fact, and I said, well, burning wood is a renewable energy under most classifications that seem to be around. And he smiled, and at the same time he said, yes, but they cause enormous pollution.
Yeah.
So and he started pointing out, we'd like you to try and get gas into this town and that town and that town, because of the pollution. And specifically the air pollution in Malin is very bad, he said, so you're in the good location. So we've had tremendous support in terms of acceptance of the technology from the government. So I think we mentioned in the prospectus, which is one of the things I wanted to clarify, the prospectus made clear that the government has got experience in ISG, to the statement, and they approved another project. There's not been a commercial operation in Chile. There hasn't been many commercial operations in many countries around the world, actually, but they have experience of being introduced to the technology, and they've called it, in their own words, we have a precedent for granting environmental approval for ISG projects.
Right.
And particularly they made it clear, which again is documented in the prospectus, that up to 3 megawatts of power generation, you don't need formal EIS submissions. This is why we've chosen 3 megawatts as our initial proof of concept, if you like, electricity production. So all in all, I haven't run into a more enthusiastic and supportive regulatory system. And like anywhere else, there are mining regulations, and as long as you stick within those and do your work properly and report properly, then we'll be supported into the future.
I think, firstly, thank you for that response. I think one of the good points that you've raised in that response was our comment in the interview about the Chilean government not having that experience. We went and then did more homework after having that discussion with yourself, Dr. Len Walker, on that component where you highlighted that, no, they indeed do have the experience. I think when we were initially looking at that sort of concept, it was more so the lack of experience they had in the commercial sense. But the experience that they do have, tell us about that. And are we really grasping at straws here when it comes to defining the Chilean government's likelihood of approving something like this based on the fact that they don't have commercial experience? Is that really not that much of an increase of experience? Is the demonstration component sufficient from your point of view?
Well, it depends how you define commercial experience.
Right.
In terms of production of gas using ISG, as I mentioned before, there's been a long history of demonstrations in a variety of countries that gives most government departments comfort, I would imagine, that there's nothing unique about the technology, and it can be developed. You can produce gas. In terms of a commercial size operation, that's another story, because in all these countries where the demonstrations have been done, apart from the former Soviet Union, there hasn't been a commercial size project. And so it's somewhat semantics. But the facts in relation to Chile are very clear, and that is around 2010, Carbon Energy, which was listed on the Australian Stock Exchange, went to Chile and actually formed a joint venture with Antofagasta Minerals, one of the biggest companies, copper producing companies in Chile, to form a joint venture to develop this technology commercially in Chile. Antofagasta were interested basically because they were getting a lot of gas at the time from Argentina, and it got cut off. So at that stage in the early 2000s, I think it was, all the large companies in Chile were very concerned about domestic energy supply. And so that's why Antofagasta got involved. Now, Antofagasta and Carbon Energy put together proposals to the government, and they got environmental approval to commence a project. And they had all the preparations on site. I've been to the site where they were planning to operate. And so there's still monitoring equipment, monitoring bores on that site. They were all ready to start. But then, of course, the government started importing coal and building coal-fired power stations, and built 2 LNG terminals. So they were getting LNG in, and the energy crisis passed. And so Antofagasta basically said, well, we're not really interested, but you can buy us out.
Right.
Ultimately, if you followed the announcements, Carbon Energy couldn't raise the finance. I actually went to see Antofagasta in Chile myself, and the sums of money they were asking to purchase the deposit, which had a JORC resource of 100 million tonnes, was so extreme as to make it untenable. And that's why we've gone and found our own coal deposits. Okay. So that's a realistic history. The Environment Department went through their files and said, yes, we've got all the documentation in relation to the environmental application. We have a precedent in our system, so we can judge you by the same precedents.
Fantastic, fantastic. Okay, we will then move on to the actual electricity production component. Again, I think when it comes to an investor's perspective, which we really need to represent to do, not only the investor justice, but also yourself, to be able to give you the platform to communicate the actual answer. But one of the big things is, okay, well, how do we get this company to a profitable state or a break-even state? Obviously, the key component is the energy production. One of the risks, again, that we highlighted, I believe in that interview with Ozbiz, at least I know it was a big discussion prior to the interview internally at the office, was that Chaucer Energy is kind of in this interesting position where you've got the competition from 2 sides, one with the actual coal miners, and then you've got the actual energy producers. So we've sort of covered the coal mining component with the current project, the Mel-Lin project. Now, with the actual energy production side of things, firstly, how much energy do we need to produce to get break even? And also, what's any comments or clarity on, I guess, the competition that exists there? I know a lot of it is imported at this stage. So Are you fighting against those guys? What's the current situation?
Essentially, we're starting off producing electricity. So if we focus on that, we're producing gas to make electricity, so we're selling electricity.
Of course, yeah.
So as in Australia, if you're producing electricity, you sell it into the grid. And so you have in Chile, you have a similar grid system, a controlled grid system with bidding prices as we have in Australia. So the market price for electricity is fairly clearly set.
Yeah.
It's a market price. You can go in and find out, like you can in Australia, what the price might be if you're bidding into the system next month or in a year's time.
Yeah.
And if you have a sizable amount, you get a power purchase agreement, PPA, negotiated that fixes the price. Now we are well aware that the current prices of electricity in Chile, a minimum of $60 a megawatt hour to $80 a megawatt hour. They're kind of international prices to a certain extent, although they're higher than many others. We've verified those prices, and they're the kind of prices we're putting into our calculations. Now, there's a need for supply of energy in Chile for electricity, and so we are just a supplier of electricity like everybody else. You have the right price, you sell your electricity. And so we're not really competing against other energy forms. We're just in the market for selling electricity commercially, as exists in Australia.
Okay.
So I guess that's the basis for the comfort for we're not competing against anybody, essentially. There's a market for us.
Okay.
The other forms of energy, coals, there's no coal mining essentially in Chile for a start. There's only one coal mine we're aware of down south. It had a history of coal mining, mostly underground in Chile, because most of the coal is underground, but there's one open cut mine operating down south. So there's not really a coal industry at all. Gas is imported. There's very little natural gas production in Chile. We're really in the business of not selling energy so much as selling finished products. And like Lee Creek Energy is planning in South Australia, after electricity, there's a range of chemical products that we can manufacture using our gas as well, and they're on our horizon sometime in the future after we've got established. So we're value-added products. We're not just selling gas.
Yeah. And forgive my naivety on this next comment, but when it comes to, so you mentioned the other coal miner that's underground. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but if they were to have this technology as well, potentially, could that be a risk? Is it easy for a company like the one that you mentioned to adopt and transition into ISG, or is that just a problem that you don't have to worry about?
It's easy for me to say it's not a problem we have to worry about, but I think the facts are fairly simple when you look at how many people worldwide are involved in the technology. It's very difficult to actually exercise, as I said early on.
Yeah.
I won't bore you with some of the details of specific types of the technology, but sufficient to say, if you look at the records, the combined group that I'm working with, which includes my colleague Michael Blinderman, who operated in the former Soviet Union, the breadth of experience we have is pretty unique, and I think it's fair to say can't be acquired easily by anybody else.
Okay, fantastic.
And there's no underground mining in Chile. We've reviewed every coal deposit in Chile. We believe we've picked the best areas that are suitable for ISG and that are identifiable by the data that's around them. And we're quite comfortable that there won't be much option for anybody else to kind of get involved in the technology.
Yeah. Okay. Fantastic. And next question, and I think it might be one of the last ones, Len, is it's around a thematic that's been going on for quite some time for most of the companies that I was discussing, especially the ones in the retail space on the channel on AusBiz. COVID was a big sort of thematic. Now, I think with the operations being international, with a lot of the practical side of COVID being quite difficult right now with anything cross-border, what problems are you facing? What problems do you expect to face, and how do you plan to address that if this COVID thematic continues, or even picks up potentially?
Well, obviously Chile's had its COVID difficulties like everybody else has, although it's declined significantly in the last few months. The first practical reality is we have a good consulting team who've working with us for 2 years in Chile, in Santiago at the moment, who are used to travelling around. Alvaro Flores is a lawyer, and he's largely been the one to make the introductions into the government departments that gives us the comfort we have. And Thomas Eggers is a very experienced geologist. They both work for large companies, and Thomas led us through the information to enable us to pick our coal deposits.
Okay.
Our first stage is drilling, obviously, and Thomas, being a drilling experienced geologist in drilling as well, is obviously available to assist us with that. The practical I might also add that during the last visits, including with my project manager, Valeri Malik, who is very familiar with the former Soviet Union activity, we've actually interviewed and have connected with a group of consultants and contractors to talk about their involvement in the project. It ranges from geological work, 2 or 3 drilling companies, hydrogeological consultant, which is important on the water side, a group who are specialists in negotiating power purchase agreements, and Valeri's actually visited 2 or 3 contractors who would build the plant that we propose to build. So we have all those contacts already established. So it's not as if we're starting off from scratch. The situation there at the moment is that for Chileans domestically, they can return to the country from outside if they have an injection, evidence of a test. Of a test. There are quarantines in some parts of the country for domestic activity, which might be 24 hours or 48 hours. But as we were well used to in Victoria, they are easily handled with a permit system by working requirements. I've had to do that myself here in Victoria, so it's not as if it's something new. The Victorian government has a special kind of advisory office in Santiago, so we have a contact with them to keep up to date with the regulations. We are not sure. There appears to be a softening whereby at the moment, like today, I think there's a 2-week quarantine required for foreigners to come into the country. But there's evidence that in the next few months that might be reduced to verification of a test as to when you come in, as it is for locals. So for our activity once in Chile and our people in Chile at the moment, there's very little restriction.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, well, in terms of the questions that I had prepared for, I think we've covered most of them, if not all. But I guess I'd like to hand it over to you for any additional comments or points that I guess you wanted to clarify, especially post the interview that I had with Koshi on AusBiz. But anything else that you'd like to add at this stage?
Well, I think we've covered, thanks to your direction, Conrad, the issues that I had with the statements made that involved the benzene discussion. You've given me the opportunity to explain that. I think I sent a technical paper that I wrote that set out the information that's available. It's in published form now, so that anybody can extract it. We left one of the issues we haven't touched on is Indonesia, and I think one of the statements was the Indonesian government declared that our permits weren't commercial, conveying the view that it would have been uneconomic if we had have started. I won't go into the details there, but in the prospectus we've made it quite clear that that wasn't the case. That in fact it was the control over the permits, the regulations over the permits that governed how we could operate that were the issue. And there's no doubt that there are commercial operations that could be undertaken, and each of the areas we're looking at would have been very commercial in the sense of profitability. We've discussed the Chilean government's climate change attitude in detail, and that was one of the issues. We've covered that very well. And the experience of the Chilean government also is something we've covered well. So I feel as though we've covered those pretty well. Mm-hmm. One of the things I would say in summary, Conrad, is it's a very simple technology to explain, as I have done, but it's very, very complex to understand and highly technical. It involves, for example, in groundwater contamination, it involves understanding chemical levels that are acceptable. And there are different levels for drinking water versus non-drinking water. And they're the kind of technical issues that are really well beyond the scope of normal press publicity. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's very easy to grab a headline saying the words groundwater contamination, but what it means is another matter altogether. So they're the kind of publicity difficulties that we always have. But on the other hand, the exercise is worth undertaking, in my opinion, because as you know from the eastern states of Australia, there's a gas shortage. It's due to political decision making about what's allowable and what's not. And as a result, industries are talking about shutting down and leaving the country because they don't get gas at an acceptable price. Government's trying to force a low price, and the producers are saying we can't make gas at $4 a gigajoule. So all of these things are relevant, and they're, I'm under no doubt that at some stage in the future, and hopefully sooner rather than later, once this is demonstrated commercially successfully, it's going to be hard to reject anywhere else. And that's really part of what our objective is. We could probably have 30-year life or more in Chile just using, we've got 2 other permits that I haven't mentioned that are highly attractive targets as well. But on the other hand, commercialisation of this technology, say at a scale like 100 megawatts, is going to lead to a huge interest from many other countries in the world. So it's got a significant future. Another point I'd make is that coal is continuous. So when we have a drill hole that hits coal, it's not necessarily like a drill hole that might hit a rich gold vein, which actually cuts out. But the deposition of coal is such that the continuity is what gives us confidence that, the data we have will be followed up by the JORC resource ultimately, simply because coal is continuous. So I'm speaking as a kind of a long-term devotee of the technology, which I apologise, but its commercialisation is really fundamentally necessary in many countries, and we'll be pursuing that as part of our long-term plans.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Walker, you really are a pioneer, I think, in this industry, especially this type of technology. And I think, like any pioneer, the difficulty that you have to face is that you're the authority and you're the person with the sort of the education, component you're spreading to everyone, and that's where sometimes things get confusing. It's always very difficult to have a good dialogue, especially in an investment forum, if you don't really understand the technology. And so I'd like to really say thank you for joining us today, especially considering some of the comments that I've made. I feel as though we've really had the opportunity to go through the nitty gritty and also give you the forum and the platform as well. It was a privilege for me to jump on AusBiz and discuss those 11 companies. But the problem is it's a very one-sided conversation. This has no constraint on time. We've got, I feel as though a lot of the points that we sort of initially had clarified, and I appreciate your sort of objectivity, I think, as well. And I think that's been communicated quite clearly from our side as well. You've been referencing strict, data points, not just opinion, and that's a very important thing for my research team to utilize as well. But yeah, again, I think at the end of the day, it shows that there's a reason why companies like us need to reach out to management and have this type of conversation and pass this on to the investor as well. At the end of the day, and I think one of the conversations that we had that I believe probably made this this interview possible was I think I said to you something along the lines of no one knows my business better than I do, and I suspect that to be the same for you. And so off that foundation, I again appreciate the time that you've put into to go through everything with us. And I guess we'll be hopefully looking to have you on the show or this video content of ours again soon. Hopefully after a successful listing, and we'll be really excited to see what you guys have in store for us. So thank you very much.
Good. Thank you very much for the time, Conrad, and I always welcome questioning and debate.
Thank you. Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.